It is such a pleasure for me to introduce Alan Thompson. He's the museum registrar at Prairie Grove Battlefield State Park. A native of Searcy, Alan studied history at the University of Arkansas, and I believe you are a member of the Hog Wild Band. As a college freshman in 1991, Alan started volunteering at Prairie Grove State Park, and from there he became a seasonal interpreter, and for the last 17 years has worked full-time, not only as museum registrar, which means he takes care of the exhibits and collections. He is also a park historian and a tour guide of the battlefield. He is also chairman of the Northwest Arkansas Civil War Heritage Trail. He's vice president of Heritage Trail Partners, and he has developed a driving tour with interpretive panels describing the Battle of Cane Hill.
When you think of the Civil War today, I think people think of Scarlett O'Hara. They think of the big epic battles and heroic generals and that sort of thing. And then once the battle's over, the two sparring mates go back to their respective corners, and that's the end of it. They don't think about what happened to the people that were killed, the people that were wounded, the civilians that lived on or near the battlefield. So that's what we're going to talk about today. When the smoke cleared at Prairie Grove at 5 p.m. on December 7th, 1862, 2,700 men lay dead or were maimed, with most of those occurring in the short 2.5 hours of infantry fighting from 2:30 till 5. As evening set in, both armies spent a few hours assessing their situations. With so much at stake, Federal General James G. Blunt determined the Union Army would stay and fight. Lacking food and ammunition, Confederate General Thomas C. Hyman decided the Confederates would return to Fort Smith. At 10 p.m., a truce of 12 hours was agreed to so that the wounded could be tended to, and around midnight, the Confederates used the cover of that truce to withdraw from the battlefield. Per the truce, both armies sent stretcher bearers to remove the wounded, and each army placed pickets to protect their lines. There's going to be lots of quotes from the soldiers because they can tell it better than I can, and there's two of them in particular that are rather lengthy, so I'll just ask y'all to bear with me through that. And this is probably not for the squeamish and the faint of heart. There's some pretty detailed quotes in here. Confederate George Watford of the 1st Texas Partisan Rangers remembered, "I was placed on picket field and stayed there all night, and when it became still, we could hear the continual moans of the wounded, which ranged from the slightest expression of pain to the greatest agony. About 2 o'clock, all had become too much for human endurance, and many had given up the struggle for life or had frozen, as the night was very cold." Sergeant Samuel Pinckney Pittman of the 34th Arkansas lived a half-mile south of the battlefield. Years after the battle, he wrote, "Naturally anxious about my family, whom I had not seen for several months, I obtained permission to visit them for a few hours, and slinging the canteens of 2 comrades over my shoulder with my own, I struck out through the woods to my home, which I found converted into a hospital. My family were, however, well and uninjured, and I was soon among the wounded who occupied all the available space in the building. Among those there, I found my 2nd lieutenant fatally, and my 3rd lieutenant slightly wounded. Our 1st lieutenant I knew was dead upon the field. Others of our company and regiment were there. The surgeons were dressing wounds and doing all that could be done for them, but the brave fellows could not hide their sufferings, and to cheer them I gave them a brief account of the battle after they had fallen. They would make special inquiry about certain members of mess or company, and when I would tell them how gallantly that friend had borne himself, their eyes would sparkle and a shout would almost break from their lips. Alas, few of those lips ever uttered battle songs again. It was no pleasure to be there and witness their sufferings, and after apprising them that morning would find us moving toward Springfield, Missouri, with the enemy in flight, I bade them goodbye, and with a sad but hopeful heart went back to the battleground. I was not long in regaining the spot where I had no doubt the command was resting. Every moment as I approached the spot, I expected to be challenged, but no challenge came. And still drawing nearer, I could see the bright barrel of my gun, which I had leaned against a fallen tree, gleaming in the moonlight. Grasping it, I almost stood without breathing and listened. Away to the south, about the top of the mountain, I caught the rumble of artillery, and the tramp of many feet was borne upon the air as it softly stirred the leaves remaining upon the trees. Down in the orchard I could hear the groans, and once or twice a shriek of intense pain. It was midnight, and up from the orchard came cries and groans, and men calling for water. I remembered seeing, as we returned from the last charge in the evening, a young officer whom I had known from childhood, horribly mutilated by a cannon shot, lying near the fence. He was alive when I passed him and begged piteously for a drink. Not being able to respond to his appeal, I only bent over him long enough to see that his wound was fatal and passed on. I now determined to go down to the orchard, and if he were still alive, give him water. I did not then know that the enemy had gone, and I cautiously crept to that part of the ground where I knew he was lying, and reached the fence, crossed it, and was alone with the dead and dying. On the same spot where I had left the young officer in the evening, he still lay. The pale, girlish face was upturned to the moonlight, and frost glistened on the brown hair. One hand clutched a bunch of dried grass, while the other rested on his breast. But from that breast the spirit had passed to its last camp beyond the river. Near him, on every side, lay men as if asleep, some still grasping their guns, while it looked as if others had carelessly thrown them aside. One whom I had thought to be dead moved and uttered a faint moan. I went to him, raised his head, placed a canteen to his lips, and bade him a drink, but death was too near, or consciousness had left him. Feeling satisfied now that no armed enemy occupied the field, I concluded to go out toward the center of the orchard where I could hear a voice calling. I thought for water. Up to this time I do not remember that I decided what to do as regarded myself. My coming into the orchard was for a special purpose, as I have stated. Once there, I decided to relieve the thirst of the wounded until the water in my canteen gave out. Passing a number of dead, I stopped near the middle of the orchard to reconnoiter. I had stood but a moment when a form in front of me and to my right raised partially on his elbow and shrieked, "Mother, mother!" This was the voice I had heard, and there was no mistaking it. In his agony and delirium, the wounded soldier had remembered his mother, and, with his life-blood fast ebbing away, his cry went out to her, who perhaps at that very moment was praying for her darling boy's safe return. But war is cruel, and the cry of loved ones is often only answered in another world. I would like to think, as the end drew near, the dying imagined his mother, felt her soft kiss upon his bloodless lips, and as the slender fingers brushed back the damp hair, heard her gentle voice say, "All is well. Lie still and sleep. Your mother is on guard tonight." Who knows? May she not have been there? Until now, nothing had seemed strange to me. I had crossed and recrossed the field so often during the day that the bodies lying upon the ground were familiar objects. But now a chill crept over me that I had not felt during the fiercest of the conflict. The moon was gliding down behind the treetops that bordered the field on the west, and long shadows stretched far out into the open ground where I was standing. And just then an owl flitted past, with that shadowy, ghost-like movement peculiar to that bird, and I began to realize the weird surroundings to such an extent that a desire possessed me to leave them behind. As I turned towards the wood on the west, the cry of that delirious boy rang out upon the still night, and I only stopped when passing 3 soldiers grouped under an apple tree, where they had managed to kindle a small fire with twigs they found near. They were all wounded and unable to leave the field. 2 wore the blue overcoats of the Federal Army, and the other the gray jacket of the rebel. But with them the war was over, and physical suffering banished all hatred. Thoughts of home, wife or mother, perhaps filled their minds, and made the ghastly wounds give more intense pain, because for them the end was near. Throughout the night, men with stretchers and ambulances worked to remove the wounded from the field. Joe Shelby's adjutant, John N. Edwards, wrote, "Through all the long, long watches, parties from both armies flitted the field with lights that gleamed like phantoms, and mingled friendly among a common work of mercy. The wounded were moved into local churches and homes, such as Samuel Pittman's. The next morning, when it became apparent the fighting was over, men from both sides expressed surprise and relief. On December 8th, parties began gathering the dead and wounded, while others took the opportunity to explore the battlefield. Describing the battlefield to his wife, Lieutenant Colonel Gad Bryan of the 1st Iowa Cavalry wrote, "It is a fearful sight to see, after one is cooled off, when the blood is no longer up to battle heat, and take a look at your own work. Dead men and horses, friends and foes, broken gun carriages, and arms all in one promiscuous heap. Men mangled in every conceivable manner, some with heads torn off, some shot clear in two, some with legs off. Blood on the ground, blood on the fences, blood on the trees. I saw trees bloody higher than you could reach, and there was a leg of one of the enemy hanging in a tree 30 feet high." William McLaughlin penned, "The sight of the dead and wounded soldiers at Prairie Grove was horrible. Never do I wish to behold such a sight again. To hear the cries of the wounded soldiers was enough to chill the blood of the most hard-hearted man." I think one soldier spoke for all when he succinctly said, "It was the awfulest sight I ever saw in my life." The wounded were initially taken to surrounding homes and buildings, but it didn't take long for them to prove insufficient, and it was also clear that neither army was adequately prepared for the carnage produced by the battle. Prairie Grove Church and area homes used by the Confederates were full of wounded men, laid in rows in the yard. A soldier who visited the Confederate wounded at Prairie Grove Church remembered, "Oh, merciful God, what a sight met our eyes. All around the church lay 3 or 4 ranks of wounded soldiers placed side by side, dozens of them dying for want of surgical aid, some bleeding to death while a bandage around an arm and a leg would have saved their lives, but no one was allowed to touch them but a surgeon with a diploma. So you see a great many of the men outside, patiently waiting for that aid, came too late, died for want of help. With heavy hearts we looked inside the church. It is brightly lighted, and rows of wounded men lay on the floor all around the 4 walls, and in the center of the room, long tables were erected where wounded men were laid, and the surgeons and their assistants were busy cutting and sawing off legs and arms and doing surgical work on all kinds of wounds." Another soldier visiting a home south of the battlefield being used, possibly Samuel Pittman's home, said that the floors were strewn with wounded, and the large yard surrounding it was also covered by them. They were lying in the hot sun, moaning piteously, while at a large table in the principal room the surgeons were busily engaged dressing the wounds and amputating limbs. After amputation, the limbs were thrown out the back door, and I observed a number of hogs feeding on them. The sight was so disgusting that I hastened away. Eventually, the Confederate wounded were taken to Cane Hill, where the college buildings and the Methodist manse provided more space. The situation was similar in the Union hospitals. The few homes on the north side of the Illinois River were inadequate for the number of casualties, and the Federal wounded were eventually moved to Fayetteville, where up to 22 buildings, including homes, churches, schools, and the Masonic Lodge, were converted into hospital wards. Ira Russell was the Federal Medical Director, and he wrote the following about the conditions at the Union Hospital in Fayetteville. At the commencement of the battle, Surgeon G.H. Hubbard, Medical Director of General Herron's command, ordered Surgeon Philip Harvey of the 19th Iowa Infantry to occupy a house 2 or 3 miles from the battlefield for a temporary hospital. This area he's talking about is around Walnut Grove, if you're familiar with that. Hither the slightly wounded repaired, while during the evening, night, and next day the more severely wounded were conveyed in ambulances. Many, however, of the severely wounded lay on the battlefield without covering for 3 days and passed dreary nights exposed to the chilling influences of the atmosphere, the ground being covered with heavy frost. Surgeon Harvey did the best he could with the limited means at his command. He performed several operations in his field hospital, but on account of the great lack of medical stores and dressings of every description, and there being but little room in the house, it was decided to delay all important operations until the wounded could be removed to more comfortable quarters and the establishment of a general hospital. Fayetteville, distant from the battlefield 10 miles, offered the only accommodations for the establishment of a hospital, to which place over rough roads in ambulances the wounded men could be conveyed. On the 9th of December, Assistant Surgeon General R.C. Ward, USA, ordered Russell and several other surgeons to move to Fayetteville without delay. Russell was appointed medical director of the District of Northwest Arkansas. He immediately on his arrival, 14 days after the battle, made an inspection of the hospital buildings and found them very much overcrowded. The maximum of airspace to each patient did not exceed 250 cubic feet. For the 500 wounded there were perhaps 50 bunks. The remainder lay upon the straw and blankets on the floor in the midst of filth, cast-off dressings, dirt of every kind, swarming vermin, and unwashed garments. The ventilation was extremely imperfect. The odor arising from suppurating wounds and the accumulating filth was intolerable. Several cases of gross neglect in consequence of drunkenness were found at which humanity shudders. Hospital gangrene and blood poisoning, those fearful consequences of overcrowded wards and foul air, had already made their appearance, and numbers, even at this early day, had fallen victim to these dreaded diseases. The nurses had been picked up here and there without reference to their qualifications. As a consequence, their apartments were in a most uncleanly condition. Garbage was thrown about the doors when it became mixed with the foul matter cast from the apartments of the sick, and the contamination produced odors suffocating and disgusting. In fine, all surroundings indicated a speedy thinning of the wards by the work of death. An inspection of the kitchen did not give more flattering results. The cooks, like the nurses, had been selected without reference to their qualifications. For 2 weeks after the battle, the diet furnished the sick and wounded was very inappropriate, consisting mainly of hard bread, hardtack, salt pork, and coffee without milk or sugar. The resources of Fayetteville were very limited, and the surrounding country had been exhausted by foraging parties from both armies. Immediately on Surgeon Russell's taking charge of the hospital, bricks were procured from the burnt buildings of Fayetteville. A large oven was constructed and a bakery established capable of supplying soft bread for 1,000 men daily. The surrounding country was scoured for eggs, chickens, butter, and fresh meats, and in a short time the sick and wounded were furnished with a diet more suitable to their condition. Dr. Carpenter was assigned the duty of providing more extensive hospital accommodations, hospital furniture, and other appliances. He entered upon the duties of his office, and the results of his labor are shown from the following extract of his report. After giving a statement of the condition in which he found the hospital, he proceeds. The work before you is obvious. Nothing but immediate regeneration promises success in either surgical or medical treatment. In order to effect this, an investigation was made of the resources at hand. It was short work, and the results showed that at your command there were 88 blankets, 350 bed sacks, 295 pillow slips, 450 sheets in the way of bedding. For cooking utensils, there were only 20 camp kettles and 40 pans. For carrying water, 12 leather buckets. Table furniture, there was none. No brooms, no cooking stoves besides those that were in use in the buildings for heat, and those were insufficient for warming the wards. Lastly, a very limited supply of medicines. Thus it will appear that the hospital has been carried on independent of the quartermaster department except for furnishing of teams to draw wood, which because of that failure of the department to keep us in supply, we were obliged to attend to ourselves. With the unlimited amounts of teams furnished and by appropriating rail fences in the vicinity, we were enabled to procure a tolerable supply of fuel. The resources of the town consisted of 2 or 3 meager stocks of sutler goods, a stove dealer with a few cooking stoves minus their furniture, and a tinner without stock with which to manufacture. Notwithstanding such was the condition of our resources. There were new wards to be opened, not only for the reception of the wounded not yet brought in from the battlefield, but in order to separate those filling the already overcrowded buildings, and to do this it was necessary to have more stoves and pipe, more cooking utensils and table furniture. In short, complete outfits for hospitals were needed with no apparent sources of supply this side of St. Louis. Nothing discouraged the work was commenced with energy equal to the emergency. Orders were issued at once and rigidly enforced in regard to cleanliness, prerequisite in every hospital. Filth was removed from the inside and garbage from the outside of the walls. The yards were cleaned, latrines constructed, and a vigilant police instituted. In addition to these measures, I was placed in charge of the hospital property to issue the same, to find new buildings for wards, and furnish them for the reception of patients, and in general terms to act as your assistant in administration of the affairs of the hospital. In pursuance of that order, I sent men to work making bunks. There being no new lumber, fences were taken instead. Bed sacks were issued, straw procured, and by the end of the first week, more than 350 bunks had been constructed, sufficient for the number of bed sacks on hand. Straw was procured, bed sacks filled, and patients placed upon them. For those having no bed sacks, boards were set up on edge upon the floor, and the straw confined so that the floors might be kept clean. During this time, buildings had been taken and fitted up, but the daily arrival of the sick from the army filled them up as soon as ready and prevented the separation so much needed in other wards. In early January, an invoice of bedding was received from Springfield, Missouri, which enabled us to put every man upon a bed sack and to give him a pillow and sheet. By an extra exertion for a few days, all the patients, more than 900 in number, were got upon these rough and hastily constructed bunks. Every day for 2 weeks swelled the number of patients. They came in squads by 10, 20, and sometimes 50 without a moment's notice and had to be provided for as best we could. By the 12th of January, the number of buildings used for hospital purposes was 22, scattered all over the village, with 2 in the country, one of which, the deserted residence of Judge Walker, the president of the convention that voted Arkansas out of the Union, was 3 miles distant from town. By this time, the number of patients in attendance had reached nearly 1,200, and it can be easily conceived that the labor of constructing a hospital under the most favorable of circumstances would be much greater in scattered and badly contrived buildings than in those especially constructed for the purpose. Every available building was taken, and in addition, all the hospital tents were pinched, yet your space was still limited. We were mindful of the Surgeon General's recommendations that each have in ordinarily ventilated buildings 1,000 cubic feet, but our resources were exhausted, and when the maximum number was reached, there was not over 400 or 500 feet for each patient. The first Sunday inspection was made January 11th, and it was truly gratifying to notice the very marked change for the better that had taken place in so brief a period. The floors were clean, the patients were on bunks, and all had sheets and pillow slips. The filth was removed from their persons, they had on clean shirts, and aside from the crowded state of the wards, they were comfortable and cheerful. Back at the battlefield, burial details took care of their laborious and unpleasant undertaking. For the most part, the dead were buried in mass graves, though there were a few individual graves scattered about. John Henry Smith of the 20th Wisconsin wrote, "We are gathering up the dead. We lay them of rows of 25, 50, or 100, owing to the number nearby. Then we dig graves 25, 50, or 100 feet long and 6 feet wide. Some of the boys get into the graves, while the others hand the dead to them, and they are laid side by side. When they are handed in, a man on the outside takes the name of each one and numbers them, 1, 2, 3, and so on down the line. Then they are all covered with the earth, and the burying done. We cut the name of each boy, his company, and his regiment on a piece of board, and set it up at their head so their friends can find them should they want to take them home." Albert Green wandered the battlefield and recorded what he saw. "We spent several hours watching the burial details of both armies gathering up the dead and putting the bodies in trenches. Little white flags on sticks were seen in different places, and the soldiers of both armies seemed friendly enough to be comrades. Moving to another portion of the battlefield, I found a man lying flat on his back. His arms extended their full length on either side. In one was clenched a lot of parched corn, and the other was gnawing convulsively into the ground. A shell had torn away part of his abdomen, and his bowels were protruding. At these, wild hogs were chewing. I drove them away and shouted for the guards, who came and bore the dying man away. He had been overlooked and had lain in this condition no less than 18 hours, although the hogs had evidently just found him." The burial parties weren't as reverent with enemy dead. Confederates unceremoniously tossed Union dead into a well, while Federals tossed dead Confederates into a trench with, and this is a quote, "about the same consideration that sacks of potatoes would have received, and when one layer had been completed, another layer was placed on top of the first, and sometimes after, their coats had been wrapped around them, and sometimes without. The clay and gravel was shoveled on and the job complete. Later, feet were protruding from the ground where there had not been enough earth to put on to cover them. A few of the more fortunate soldiers were placed in caskets. William Morton, who lived on the west end of the battlefield, watched as his barn was dismantled and the lumber used to build the boxes. Federal wounded remained in Fayetteville until February of 1863, when those still remaining were taken to Springfield, Missouri. In March of 1863, there were still nearly 200 Confederate wounded at Cane Hill. Many soldiers who had previously been eager to see combat and for a chance to thrash their enemy had their curiosities and desires satisfied. Dozens of letters and diaries contained remarks such as, "I am satisfied with warring. I hope I will never be in another," or I had a great longing to see a battle, as you are aware. Now I've had my curiosity gratified." None were as low as Captain Henry C. Palmer of the 11th Kansas Cavalry, one of the Union pickets the night of the battle. He wrote, "I was relieved at midnight and wandered half a mile to the right, trying to find some place where I might keep warm enough to fall asleep, not caring whether I ever woke up again or not." Along with the killed and wounded, the battle took its toll on those fortunate enough to avoid physical harm. Earlier I mentioned Samuel Pittman walking home to find his house been turned into the hospital, and William Morton had his barn turned into caskets. Caledonia Borden was a 9-year-old girl at the time of the battle, and years later recorded in her memoir. "After dark it got quiet and we came out of the cellar. There was a dead man across the cellar door, and wounded and dying men all around. I can hear them calling, 'Help, help, help.' The men worked through the night helping the wounded. Yankees and rebels all got the same care. 4 died that night. One soldier's leg was just hanging by the skin, and the doctor cut it off and threw it outside. It was scary and pitiful. Some of us got sick." Julia West Pyatt remembered, "All available beds and bedding was used for the wounded except for one bed they left for mother and the children, but very few of us slept. We were left with hundreds of wounded and dead. For days, people hunted the battleground for some of their missing people. On Monday, we saw 4 houses burned to the ground that was set on fire by the Federal troops. We lived in the house with the wounded for 6 weeks." Loved ones back home were notified of their loss by casualty lists printed in newspapers. Others received letters written by a friend of the deceased. Henry Patterson of the 19th Iowa was in a Springfield, Missouri hospital with an illness and missed the battle. On December 20th, 2 weeks after the fight, he learned of the death of his brother by reading a letter written to a comrade in the hospital. He then wrote his family back home. "Today is the first I have heard the news that James is killed. May God sustain you. Dear mother and sisters, under this awful calamity I cannot realize the truth after 10 days of suspense and anxiety. It is almost unsupportable to know that he, my noble brother, the nearest and dearest friend I had on earth, fell, and I could not be there to soothe him and hear from his lips a message of love to you all." Columbus Gray of the 34th Arkansas Infantry on the Confederate side also had the unenvious task of notifying his parents of his brother's death. I take the opportunity of informing you all of the death of my dear and beloved brother. He was killed on the 7th instant. We was ordered to charge, and we all broke, and Ad got ahead. He run up in 10 steps of the enemy before they hit him. They fired and run. When I got to him, I stopped and squatted down by him. I laid my hand on his head, and I said, "Oh, brother, where are you hurt?" But he could not speak to me. I saw that he was breathing his last. It almost run me distracted. I did not know what to do. Ad was hit in the left side under the rib. I knew I could not do him any good by staying there with him, so I jumped up and run on with the company. Now I expect you want to know what I done with my brother's body. I am sorry to say that I had to leave him on the field. Just at night I went to him. Oh my God, he looked so pale and bad, and there was a tear in one of his eyes. I threw my arms around him and hallowed to some of the boys to come and help me carry him off the field, and they would not come to me. John Kick told me to come away from him, that we could not take him off. So I laid him on his back and straightened him out and had to leave him. You must all write to me often, for I do feel mighty sad and lonesome. May God have mercy on us all is my prayers. So goodbye. Recently, a couple of documents have come to light that have shed a great deal of insight into the aftermath of the battle. One is called The Medical, Surgical, and Sanitary History of the Battle of Prairie Grove by the medical director Ira Russell. Besides the description of the conditions in Fayetteville, it lists many of the wounded soldiers by their name, the treatment they received, including medicines administered, and a daily update on their condition. It's just a gold mine. And here's a couple of examples I'll read from it. And he breaks down every kind of wound, arm, shoulder, chest, abdomen, face, whatever. And then there were 23 cases in Herron's division of amputation of the thigh, and 19 of those guys ended up dying. 35-year-old Harrison O'Hara was admitted to the hospital on December 10th, 3 days after the battle, with a gunshot wound in the right knee. For several days he seemed to be doing well, but finally synovitis, which is the lining in the joint, inflammation of that, and fever were developed, and inflammation and suppuration of the knee joint followed. It was finally determined to amputate the thigh as affording the only chance of recovery. Dr. Harvey amputated the thigh at its lower third by a lateral flap operation on January 1st, 23 days after receipt of the injury, and the patient died 9 days later from pyemia, the blood infection, or blood poisoning. Jesse Blackburn of the 20th Wisconsin had his leg amputated on December 12th. For the next 6 days, he was reported daily as improving until the evening of the 18th. That night, Dr. Bruner, being confined to his bed by sickness, his hospital steward, while undoing the dressing of the stump, pulled off one of the ligatures. The patient soon commenced bleeding, which was promptly checked by the application of the tourniquet. But during the night, it burst out again, and before help could be obtained, he was dead. Dr. Bruner reports that he is satisfied that but for this unfortunate circumstance, the patient might have recovered. And there's probably 70 or 80 wounded soldiers that it gives us for every, December 8th, how is this guy responding to treatment? December 9th, December 10th. It's just amazing. The other document we have, I actually found it on Ancestry.com. It's a list that shows where all the Union soldiers that were moved to the National Cemetery, where they were buried at and where they came from. It's something we never had before. It's just incredible what this thing has. And it's not just for Prairie Grove. This is for the entirety of northwest Arkansas, McDonald County, Missouri, everybody that was moved. And with that, I guess that's the end. And when you visit the battlefield, think about this stuff. Don't just think about Gone with the Wind and the romantic side of it. Think about these guys and what happened with them.
This podcast was produced by the Shiloh Museum of Ozark History. We welcome your comments. You can email us at Shiloh, that's SHILOH, at springdalear.gov. If you'd like more information about the museum in general, you can visit our website at shilohmuseum.org.